In the final quarter of 2024, 40,000 rental properties across London were listed for sale by landlords leaving the market. By the first quarter of 2025, only 3,600 of those properties had been bought by new landlords willing to continue renting them out. The rest were snapped up by owner-occupiers, investors who'll sit on them, or they're still working their way through the sales process. Do the maths on that, and you're looking at roughly 18,000 rental homes that have simply vanished from the market in a matter of months. And that's just London. Across the UK as a whole, more than 50,000 rental properties were pulled from the market in 2024 alone. These aren't properties that burned down or got demolished. They still exist. They're just no longer available to rent. So where did they go? And what happens to the people who desperately need them? The numbers paint a picture that's genuinely alarming. Data from 20EA, a property research firm, shows that in the first quarter of 2025, 15.6% of all property sales across the UK were former rental properties. That's over 70,000 homes that used to house tenants and are now being sold off. Compare that to the same period last year, when the figure was 9.8%, and you're looking at a 60% increase in landlords exiting the market in just 12 months. In the fourth quarter of 2024, nearly 40,000 rental properties were listed for sale. Of the properties that completed sales, only 2.9%, roughly 3,600, were purchased by new landlords who intended to continue renting them out. With typical completion rates of 50 to 55%, that means approximately 18,000 homes left London's rental market between late 2024 and early 2025. London is being hit harder than anywhere else. Nearly 1 in 4 homes currently for sale in the capital are former rental properties, compared to the national average of 15%. The total stock of available rental properties in London has hit an all-time low of 284,000, down 18% from the first quarter of 2024 and down 23% compared to pre-pandemic levels. A joint report by Savills and the London School of Economics found that London's rental stock has fallen by 41% since the pandemic began. Nationally, the picture isn't much better. In July 2024, there were 276,000 rental properties available across the UK, down from 369,000 in July 2019. That's a 25% reduction in just 5 years. The supply of rental homes is collapsing, and it's happening faster than anyone predicted. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are homes where families lived, where people built their lives, where children went to school, where professionals commuted from to keep the city running. When 18,000 rental homes disappear in a matter of months, thousands of people are left with nowhere to go. Right now, 46% of available rental properties in London cost over £1,500 a month. 15% cost over £3,000. The average rent agreed on a new tenancy is £1,767 a month, a figure that's unaffordable for the majority of working Londoners. Competition remains brutal. There are still roughly 10 applications for every property that comes on the market, double the pre-pandemic norm of 5. Demand is 30% above where it was in 2019, and supply is shrinking every month. The result is human misery on a massive scale. Families are being pushed out of areas they've lived in for decades. Young professionals are giving up on London entirely and relocating to cities where rents are remotely manageable. Key workers like teachers, nurses, and police officers are commuting 90 minutes or more each way because they can't afford to live anywhere near where they work. Over 1.1 million people rent privately in London alone. When you remove 18,000 homes from that pool in just a few months, the knock-on effects are catastrophic. Councils in boroughs like Newham and Brent are now placing homeless families outside London entirely because there's simply no affordable accommodation left. Working professionals with full-time jobs and decent salaries are being classified as homeless because they can't find anywhere to live that they can afford. The safety net has collapsed, and there's nothing underneath to catch people when they fall. So why are landlords abandoning the market in such staggering numbers? The answer is a financial death spiral that's been building for years and has now reached a breaking point. Back in January 2022, the Bank of England base rate was 0.25%. Today, it's 5%. It briefly dipped to 4.5% earlier in 2025, but it's climbing again. For landlords with mortgages on their rental properties, and the vast majority of them do have mortgages, that change has been devastating. A mortgage of £150,000 cost roughly £300 a month in interest payments back in 2022. Today, that same mortgage costs around £640 a month. That's more than double, and rental income hasn't kept pace. Many landlords are now losing money every single month, even with tenants in place, and rent being paid on time. Mortgage arrears have jumped 93% in just 1 year. These aren't people who took on too much debt or made reckless decisions. These are ordinary landlords who borrowed sensibly when rates were low and are now being crushed by costs they couldn't have predicted. Rental yields in London have collapsed to between 3 and 4% annually. That's the return landlords get on their investment after all costs are accounted for. Compare that to Manchester or Birmingham, where yields are still sitting at 7 to 8%. And you can see why London landlords are looking at their spreadsheets and deciding it's simply not worth the hassle anymore. But it's not just about yields. The tax environment has become brutally hostile as well. Between 2017 and 2020, the government phased in something called Section 24 tax changes, which removed mortgage interest relief for landlords. Before those changes, landlords could deduct their mortgage interest payments from their rental income before calculating their tax liability. Now they can't. For higher-rate taxpayers, that change alone wiped out any profit they were making. You're now taxed on your gross rental income, not your net income after costs, which means you can actually end up paying tax on money you never received because it all went to the bank in interest payments. On top of that, there's a stamp duty surcharge on second properties. It started at 3% in 2016, and the October 2024 budget increased it to 5%. Buying a rental property has become significantly more expensive, and the changes to capital gains tax that came into effect in April 2025 created a rush of landlords trying to sell before the new tax year kicked in, and their bills got even higher. The maths simply doesn't work anymore. You've got higher mortgage costs, lower yields, punishing tax rules, and rising expenses across the board. Repairs and maintenance costs have climbed significantly thanks to inflation. 80% of landlords cite repair costs as the single biggest financial pressure they're facing. Plumbers, electricians, builders, everyone's raised their rates, and landlords are absorbing those costs whilst being told they can only increase rent once a year under the new regulations. For many, the business model has collapsed entirely. They're not making money, they're losing it. And when that happens, there's only one rational decision to make: sell up and get out. And then the regulations started piling up, turning what was already a difficult financial situation into something completely unmanageable. From 2028, every rental property in England will need to meet a minimum energy performance certificate rating of C. For older properties, and London is absolutely full of them, that means new boilers, insulation, double glazing, rewiring, sometimes major structural work. A study by Rightmove estimated that 2.9 million rental properties across the UK need upgrading to meet the new standards, with a total cost of £23 billion. That works out to roughly £8,000 per landlord on average. But in London, where properties are older and more expensive to upgrade, the costs can easily run to £10,000, £15,000 or even £25,000 per property. For a landlord with 2 or 3 flats, that's a bill of 30 to 75 grand just to stay compliant. Post-Grenfell fire safety regulations have forced landlords in certain buildings to contribute tens of thousands of pounds toward cladding removal and building safety upgrades. These aren't optional, they're legal requirements, and landlords who don't comply face fines, legal action, and the potential loss of their property. On top of that, general repair and maintenance obligations have been tightened. 80% of landlords say these costs are their biggest financial pressure, and they're only going up. And then there's the Renters' Rights Act, which received royal assent on the 27th of October 2025 and is now law. Section 21 no-fault evictions have been abolished. Notice periods have doubled from 2 months to 4. All evictions now have to go through the courts, and with the county courts already massively backlogged, that process can take 6 to 9 months or longer. Landlords can no longer refuse pets without a good reason. There's a mandatory landlord database that everyone has to register on. And a WAB's law is coming, which sets strict timeframes for fixing hazards like damp and mold. Emergency repairs within 24 hours, investigations within 10 working days, properties made safe within 5 days. Each new regulation adds cost, risk, and hassle. And whilst the government insists these measures are necessary to protect tenants, they're having the opposite effect by driving landlords out of the market in droves. Small landlords, who make up 45% of the sector and typically own just one rental property, simply can't absorb these costs. They don't have the cash reserves, the legal teams, or the scale to navigate an increasingly complex and expensive regulatory environment. So they're selling. And they're doing it now, whilst they still can. The timing of this exodus tells its own story. Landlords aren't waiting around to see how the new regulations play out. They're selling now before the laws fully take effect, because they know once Section 21 is abolished and the new system kicks in, getting out will become significantly harder. The abolition of Section 21 is expected to come into full force sometime in spring or summer 2026. There's a mechanism where Section 21 notices served before the commencement date will still be honoured under the old rules, but that window is closing fast. Industry bodies pushed for at least 6 months' notice before the Big Bang implementation date, but the government hasn't confirmed that yet. So landlords are rushing to serve notices, list properties, and complete sales before they get trapped in a system where evicting even a problematic tenant requires a court battle that can drag on for most of a year. The data backs this up. 67% of landlords across the UK say they're planning to either exit the market entirely or significantly reduce the number of properties they own in 2025. In London, it's even worse. 42% say they're planning to leave the market altogether. Not reduce, leave. 88% of landlords say they have no confidence whatsoever in the future of the rental sector, and in London, that figure climbs to 90%. Only 2% of London landlords are planning to expand their portfolios. Everyone else is either holding steady out of necessity or actively trying to get out. Google Trends data shows that demand for buy-to-let mortgages in January 2025 was at its lowest level in 5 years. People aren't entering the market, they're fleeing it. And they're not waiting to see how bad things get. They're getting out now, whilst they still have the option. But where are these properties actually going? That's the crucial question, because if they were just being bought by other landlords, the rental supply would remain stable. But that's not what's happening. Only 2.9% of the rental properties sold in the fourth quarter of 2024 were purchased by new landlords who intended to continue renting them out. The rest are being bought by owner-occupiers who plan to live in them, by investors who'll sit on them and leave them empty or use them as holiday homes where regulations permit, or they're stuck in limbo during probate and sale processes. Once a rental property is sold to an owner-occupier, it's gone from the rental market permanently. That tenant who was living there has to find somewhere else, and with supply shrinking, that's becoming harder and harder. There are currently 272,000 long-term empty properties across England, homes that have been vacant for 6 months or longer. Some of these are former rentals caught up in estate sales or waiting for refurbishment. Others are investment properties held by owners who have no intention of renting them out. And the build-to-rent sector, which is supposed to be the solution to the vanishing private landlords, isn't filling the gap. There are roughly 250,000 build-to-rent homes across the UK. That sounds like a lot until you realise that over 400,000 private rental properties have disappeared in the past few years. That's a net loss of 150,000 rental homes, even with institutional investment coming into the market. And build-to-rent starts are down 45% year-on-year. Developers are pausing projects because the returns don't justify the construction costs, and planning permissions are harder to secure. The cavalry isn't coming. The gap is widening, not closing. London is bearing the brunt of this collapse more than any other city in the UK. The capital accounts for a disproportionate share of landlord exits for several reasons. Property values are higher in London, but rental yields are the lowest in the country at just 3 to 4%. Mortgage costs hit harder when you're borrowing against a £500,000 property than a £200,000 one. Compliance costs are higher as well. Upgrading a Victorian terrace in Hackney to meet EPCC standards costs significantly more than upgrading a 1980s semi in Leeds. Building safety costs in London's tower blocks are astronomical. And foreign investment, which used to prop up the market, has dried up. Between 2010 and 2020, international buyers poured £50 billion into London property. In 2024, foreign investment dropped to levels not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. Institutional landlords, the big pension funds and real estate companies, are pulling out as well. The smart money has looked at the numbers and decided London property isn't worth it anymore. The data is stark. Since the pandemic, London's rental stock has fallen by 41%. Four-bedroom family homes have been hit hardest, with supply down 46%. Nearly 1 in 4 properties currently for sale in London are former rentals, compared to 15% nationally. London isn't just experiencing the same crisis as the rest of the country at a slightly higher intensity. It's the canary in the coal mine, showing what's coming for other cities if the trends continue. And the trends are continuing. In fact, they're accelerating. What happens next isn't hard to predict. More regulations are coming throughout 2025 and 2026, and each phase of implementation will trigger another wave of exits. Awaab's law, which currently applies to social housing, will be extended to private rentals at some point, likely in 2026 or 2027. The Decent Homes Standard, which sets minimum quality requirements, is expected to reach the private rental sector sometime in the 2030s, possibly as late as 2035. Every new requirement, every additional cost, every increase in bureaucracy and risk pushes more landlords toward the door. And once they're gone, they're not coming back. There's no mechanism in the government's plans to bring landlords back into the market. No incentives, no tax relief, no support. Just more regulations and higher costs. The government keeps promising new housing. 88,000 new homes a year for London, they say. But the city is only actually building around 50,000 a year, and that figure isn't increasing. It's stagnating or declining in many areas. Planning permissions are at their lowest level since 2006. Developers are pausing or cancelling projects because the economics don't work. Land is expensive, construction costs are high, and they can't charge enough rent or sell at high enough prices to make the numbers stack up. The gap between what's needed and what's being delivered is enormous, and it's widening every year. Supply will continue shrinking for the foreseeable future. Rents will continue rising, competition will get fiercer, and more families will be displaced, forced out of areas they've lived in for generations, pushed to the fringes or beyond. In the fourth quarter of 2024, 40,000 rental properties across London were listed for sale. By the first quarter of 2025, only 3,600 had been re-let by new landlords. Roughly 18,000 homes disappeared from the rental market in just a few months. Across the UK, more than 50,000 rental properties were pulled from the market in 2024 alone. Since the pandemic began, London has lost 41% of its rental stock. That's nearly half the available homes gone in less than 5 years. The exodus is being driven by tripled mortgage costs, collapsed rental yields, an avalanche of new regulations, punishing tax changes, and a political environment that treats landlords as villains rather than providers of essential housing. Where did these homes go? They were bought by owner-occupiers who plan to live in them. They were snapped up by investors who'll sit on them or convert them to other uses. They're stuck in probate or sales processes, sitting empty for months. But they're not being bought by other landlords because almost nobody wants to be a landlord in London anymore. The build-to-rent sector can't fill the gap. Even with institutional investment, there's a net loss of over 150,000 rental homes nationally. London is the worst affected, with 1 in 4 property sales being former rentals. And what's coming next is more of the same. More regulations phasing in over the next year or two. More landlords hitting their breaking point and deciding to sell. More rental homes vanishing from the market. Fewer options for tenants, higher rents, fiercer competition, more displacement. The government wanted to protect tenants. That was the stated aim of the Renters' Rights Act and all the regulations that came before it. But removing supply does the opposite. When 50,000 homes vanish from the market and there's no plan to replace them, everyone loses. Tenants lose because there are fewer homes to choose from and rents keep climbing. Landlords lose because their investments have become unviable. Communities lose because families are forced to leave. The city loses because the people who keep it running can't afford to live here anymore. The rental market London desperately needs is disappearing, one sold property at a time. And unless something changes dramatically and soon, it's not coming back.